The bulldozer was already warming up when Isaiah Cole stepped onto the sidewalk. He was 68 years old, wearing an old army jacket and holding a folded envelope in one hand. A city inspector pointed toward the yellow notice taped across Isaiah's front door. "Mr. Cole, you have until 5 o'clock to vacate the property." Isaiah looked at the notice. Then he looked at the house. Then at the bulldozer waiting across the street. "You're tearing down my home?" The inspector didn't hesitate. "It's condemned." Isaiah slowly unfolded the envelope. Inside was a document older than the city employee standing in front of him. "You should probably read this before you knock down anything." The inspector glanced at it. Then laughed. "Sir, whatever that is, it doesn't change the order." Isaiah folded the paper again. "No," he said quietly. "But what you're holding doesn't change the order." He looked toward the city hall building 3 blocks away. "It changes who owns the ground you're standing on." The inspector's smile disappeared. Because neither of them knew yet that the original deed to the entire block carried a name that had been erased from the city's records for more than 60 years. And that name belonged to Isaiah Cole's father. Isaiah Cole had lived in the same brick house on Mercer Street for 42 years. The neighborhood had changed around him. The grocery store where his wife used to buy peaches had become a pharmacy. The barber shop where Isaiah had taken his son every Saturday morning had become a cell phone store. 3 houses across the street had been replaced by expensive townhomes with narrow balconies and oversized windows. But Isaiah's house remained. 2 stories. Red brick. White porch railing. A small magnolia tree beside the driveway. And a brass number 214 mounted beside the front door. To most people it looked old. To Isaiah it was family. His wife, Evelyn, had planted the magnolia tree the summer they moved in. His daughter learned to ride a bicycle on that sidewalk. His son had left for college from that front porch. Isaiah had returned to it after serving 22 years in the United States Army. He had spent most of his adult life believing that if he worked hard enough, paid what he owed, and kept his word, the things he built would eventually become permanent. He was wrong about one thing. Nothing becomes permanent just because you earned it. Sometimes you have to prove it. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Notice of municipal acquisition. Isaiah read it twice, then a third time. The city wanted his property. The explanation was vague. Urban redevelopment. Public safety concerns. Neighborhood revitalization. There was no meaningful conversation. Just a deadline. Isaiah called the number printed at the bottom. A woman answered. Municipal Planning Department. "My name is Isaiah Cole. I received a notice about my property." "Yes, Mr. Cole. You want to buy my house? It's part of a larger redevelopment project." "I didn't say I wanted to sell." There was a pause. "We understand that. Then why are you sending me paperwork telling me to leave?" Another pause. "Mr. Cole, the city has legal authority to acquire properties when they're required for public development." Isaiah looked through the window toward his backyard. The magnolia tree moved slightly in the wind. "What kind of development?" "A mixed-use corridor." "Meaning?" "Retail, apartments, parking, pedestrian access." Isaiah almost laughed. "So you're replacing my house with a parking lot?" "That's not exactly how I'd phrase it." "It's exactly how I'd phrase it." The woman sighed. "You'll receive a compensation offer." Isaiah looked at the letter again. He knew what that meant. They weren't asking. They were telling him what his home was worth. And they were hoping he would be tired enough to accept. The offer arrived 9 days later. $182,000. Isaiah stared at the number. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was insulting. His property alone had recently been valued at nearly 3 times that amount. He called the city again. This time a man named Paul Denton answered. "Mr. Cole, I've reviewed your file." "Good. I think you're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Isaiah leaned back in his chair. "How am I making it difficult?" "You're refusing a reasonable offer." "Reasonable to whom?" "Based on the city's valuation." "Then your valuation is wrong." Paul's tone hardened. "The city has independent appraisers." "So do I." "You're not going to stop this project." "I didn't say I was." "Then what do you want?" Isaiah looked at an old photograph hanging above his desk. It showed him and Evelyn standing in front of the house on the day they moved in. "I want you to tell me why my property is suddenly worth less than the buildings around it." Paul didn't answer. Isaiah noticed. "That's what I thought." He hung up. 2 days later another letter arrived. This one carried a different tone. Final notice. Isaiah walked outside and looked at the street. Across from him, a survey crew had already painted orange marks along the sidewalks. He approached one of the workers. "What are those?" "Utility lines." "For what?" The man hesitated. "Development." Isaiah looked at the painted curb. Then at his house. Then at the large empty warehouse at the end of the block. Something didn't make sense. If the city wanted to redevelop the neighborhood, why were they moving so quickly? Why were several properties receiving different offers? Why had the city purchased 3 houses for far more than his? And why was his property the only one being classified as a safety problem? Isaiah went back inside. He opened a drawer, pulled out an old photograph, then another, then a folder Evelyn had kept for decades. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Ask your father about the west lot. Isaiah stared at the sentence. He hadn't seen it in years. His father, Samuel Cole, had died when Isaiah was 31. Samuel had been a mechanic, a quiet man, a black man who had spent most of his life being told what he could not own, where he could not live, and which doors were not meant to open for him. But Samuel had owned land. That was something Isaiah remembered clearly. What he couldn't remember was exactly how much. The next morning, Isaiah drove to the county archives. The clerk at the front desk looked at his request. Property records for Mercer Street? Yes. Which parcel? 214. She typed. Current owner? Me. She looked at the screen. That's strange. Isaiah leaned forward. What? This property has an older reference number. Can I see it? She frowned. It's been archived. Then bring it out. She disappeared for several minutes. When she returned, she carried a thin cardboard box. Isaiah opened it. Inside were property maps, tax records, transfer documents, and finally a deed. The paper was yellow. The ink had faded. But the name was still readable. Samuel Elijah Cole. Isaiah's father. Isaiah's hands stopped moving. He read the document again. The deed wasn't for 214 Mercer Street. It was for something much larger. The original parcel included the entire eastern side of the block, including the property where the city now planned to build its redevelopment project. Isaiah looked at the clerk. Why isn't this in the current record? I don't know. Find out. She returned to her computer. A few minutes later, she frowned again. There's a transfer. To whom? Looks like a municipal authority. When? She looked at the screen. 1963. Isaiah went still. His father had supposedly sold the land in 1963, but Isaiah knew something about that year. His father couldn't have sold it, because Samuel Cole had been serving in the army overseas. He had been in Germany. Isaiah had the letters to prove it. The clerk looked at him. Mr. Cole? Isaiah slowly folded the deed. My father didn't sign this. Isaiah spent the next week searching. He found his father's military records. He found letters. He found photographs. And eventually he found the document that changed everything. A military travel record showed Samuel Cole had been stationed in Frankfurt from March through December of 1963. The property transfer was dated July 17th. The signature supposedly belonged to Samuel. But Samuel had been thousands of miles away. Isaiah took the documents to an attorney. Her name was Renee Wallace. She was 45, sharp, patient, and not impressed by city officials. She placed the deed beneath a bright lamp. Then she looked at the military records. This isn't a minor discrepancy. What is it? The signature. Isaiah waited. Renee pulled out a magnifying glass. Your father's signature on his military documents doesn't match this one. I know. No. I mean significantly. She pointed. Look at the capital S. Isaiah leaned closer. His father's signature always began with a large curved S. The signature on the deed began with a straight line. Someone forged it, Isaiah said. Possibly. Then the city stole my father's land. Renee didn't answer immediately. Not yet. Isaiah looked at her. What do you mean? We need to prove who knew. And if we do? Renee closed the folder. Then this isn't just a property dispute. What is it? A chain of title problem. Isaiah waited. She looked him directly in the eye. If the transfer was fraudulent, every transaction that came afterward could be affected. Isaiah understood. The city wasn't simply trying to take his house. They might be trying to develop land they never legally owned. And someone had known about the old deed. Because 3 years earlier, a city attorney had requested the same archived records. Isaiah stared at the request form. The name was familiar. Paul Denton. The same man who had told Isaiah the city had already decided his property was coming down. Isaiah requested a meeting with the mayor. He expected resistance. Instead, the mayor agreed. Mayor Caroline Brooks had been in office for 6 years. She was known as a practical politician. Not flashy. Not theatrical. She had built her reputation on redevelopment. The meeting took place inside City Hall. Paul Denton sat beside her. Isaiah sat across from them with Renee Wallace. The mayor opened the meeting. Mr. Cole, I want to assure you that nobody is trying to disrespect you. Isaiah looked at her. Then why did your city issue a demolition order against my house? We believe the property was legally subject to acquisition. Based on what? Paul answered. The title history. Isaiah placed the original deed on the table. Then you should have read it. Paul's face changed. The mayor looked down. She picked up the document. Where did you get this? County Archives. She read the name. Samuel Elijah Cole. Then she looked at Paul. Were you aware of this? Paul hesitated. I'm aware of historical documents related to the redevelopment zone. That isn't what I asked. Isaiah watched him carefully. Were you aware my father owned this land? Paul looked at the mayor. The mayor looked back at him. Neither answered. Renee pushed another document across the table. This is the military record establishing Mr. Cole's father was overseas when the transfer was supposedly executed. The mayor read it. Her expression changed. Paul? We need to verify the chain. You already did. Silence. Isaiah looked between them. You knew. Paul stood. I knew there was an old title issue. And you still sent me a condemnation notice? The city had legal counsel review the matter. Did that counsel tell you the deed might be invalid? Paul didn't answer. The mayor's voice became quiet. Paul. He looked at her. Did they? Paul finally said it. Yes. The room went silent. Isaiah leaned back. So you knew. Paul tried to explain. The project had already been approved. That doesn't answer my question. The city had millions invested. So you decided my family should pay for your mistake? No. Isaiah's voice remained calm. You decided I wouldn't know enough to stop you. Paul said nothing. The mayor looked sick. She had just realized the redevelopment project she'd spent 6 years defending might have been built on stolen property. Renee wasn't finished. She placed another map on the table. It was an original city planning map from 1958. The block was marked differently. The land wasn't divided into individual parcels. It was one large property, owned by Samuel Cole. The mayor stared at it. Why would this be missing from our records? Renee answered. That's what we're investigating. Isaiah pointed to a handwritten note on the corner. What does that say? Renee leaned closer. She read it slowly. Reserved for community development. The mayor frowned. What does that mean? Isaiah looked at the map. His father had always talked about building something. A mechanic's shop. A small training center. A place where young men could learn a trade. Isaiah suddenly remembered something. His father had once told him. They'll tell you the land isn't yours until you have papers proving it. Isaiah had thought he was talking about prejudice. Now he realized his father had been talking about something specific. Samuel had known someone wanted his land. And he had been preparing for it. Isaiah reached into his jacket. He pulled out a small brass key. I found this in my father's old toolbox. Renee looked at it. What does it open? I don't know. The mayor looked confused. Isaiah stood. I think I do now. Samuel Cole's old mechanic shop had been demolished decades earlier. But the original building had a basement. Isaiah knew where it was. He drove there with Renee. Behind a newer commercial building was a narrow concrete stairwell. The door was sealed. Isaiah tried the brass key. Fit. The lock turned. Inside was a room barely large enough for a desk. Dust covered everything. On the wall was an old photograph of Samuel standing beside several black workers. Behind them was a sign. Cole Community Trade Center. Isaiah stared. His father had built it. Or planned to. But it had never opened. On the desk sat a metal box. Inside were letters. Receipts. Blueprints. And one final document. A letter addressed to Samuel from a local attorney. The date was October 1963. It said the city had pressured Samuel to sell. He had refused. The attorney warned him that officials were attempting to acquire the land through a third party. Then came the sentence Isaiah had been searching for all his life. If they cannot convince you to sell, they may attempt to make the property appear abandoned or legally transferred. Keep every original document. Isaiah closed his eyes. His father hadn't simply lost the land. He had been fighting to keep it. Renee found something else. A carbon copy of a complaint Samuel had prepared. It named 3 city officials. One of them had been the predecessor of the current redevelopment director. The other 2 had died decades ago. But the third name was still alive. And that person had served as a consultant on the current project. Isaiah looked at Renee. Now we know why they moved so fast. Renee nodded. They weren't just redeveloping the block. They were trying to bury the evidence. The city scheduled an emergency public hearing. Hundreds attended. Reporters filled the back rows. Residents stood along the walls. The mayor sat at the front. Paul Denton was absent. Isaiah sat beside Renee. When the hearing began, the mayor spoke first. Today we are here because serious questions have been raised concerning the historical ownership of the Mercer Street redevelopment zone. A murmur moved through the room. Then Isaiah stood. He carried his father's old metal box. He placed it on the podium. My father was a mechanic. He looked around the room. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful. He didn't have lawyers following him around. But he owned this land. He held up the original deed. And somebody decided that because he was a black man in 1963, his signature could be replaced. The room became completely silent. Isaiah showed the military records. The maps. The letters. The complaint. Then he looked directly at the mayor. My father spent his life believing that one day this country would judge people by what they built instead of what they looked like. He paused. I don't need the city to give me something it never owned. I need the city to admit what happened. The mayor stood. And to Isaiah's surprise, she walked toward the podium. She did not defend the city. She did not defend the project. She did not defend Paul Denton. Instead she said, Mr. Cole is right. A wave of whispers moved through the room. The city failed him. She turned toward the audience. And we will not hide behind paperwork to avoid admitting it. Then she announced the decision. The redevelopment project was suspended. Every property transaction connected to the original parcel would be investigated. And the city would recognize the Cole family's claim pending final judicial review. But Isaiah wasn't finished. He had one request. He didn't want the entire block returned to him personally. He wanted his father's original idea restored. A community trade center. A place where young people could learn mechanics, electrical work, construction, welding, and other skilled trades. The mayor looked at him. You want to build it here? Isaiah nodded. My father wanted to. What stopped him? Isaiah looked at the old photograph. People who thought his dream was worth less because his name was Samuel Cole. 6 months later, the court ruled. The 1963 transfer was invalid. The original property rights had never been legally extinguished. The city had no lawful basis for the condemnation order. The development project was cancelled. But the story didn't end there. Isaiah had a choice. He could sell the land. Developers offered him millions. One offer alone was enough to make him financially independent for the rest of his life. Renee asked him what he wanted to do. Isaiah smiled. My father already told me. What did he say? He wanted a place where young people could learn something useful. So Isaiah kept the land. And he built the center. Not a monument. Not a luxury development. A working building. Inside were classrooms, workshops, tool rooms, computer stations, and a scholarship office. Above the entrance was a simple sign. The Samuel E. Cole Trade and Community Center. On opening day, Isaiah stood outside. Hundreds came. Former residents. Local business owners. Teachers. Veterans. Students. And people who had never heard of Mercer Street before the controversy. The mayor stood beside Isaiah. So did Renee. But Isaiah looked past them. He looked at the young people entering the building. One boy carried a welding helmet. Another held a toolbox. A teenage girl walked inside wearing work boots and safety glasses. Isaiah smiled. His father's dream was finally alive. The city changed after that. Not overnight. Nothing that important happens overnight. The redevelopment department created a permanent historical property review system. Old deeds were digitized. Residents received legal assistance when property disputes involved municipal acquisition. And every major redevelopment project required an independent review of historical ownership records. The changes weren't glamorous. No television cameras came for most of them. But they mattered. Because the lesson wasn't simply that Isaiah Cole had won. The lesson was that his father had almost disappeared from the records. And if Isaiah hadn't questioned the notice taped to his door, the city might have demolished the house before anyone discovered the truth. Sometimes history doesn't disappear because someone destroys it. Sometimes it disappears because nobody bothers to look. A year after the trade center opened, Isaiah returned to his father's old basement room. The city had preserved the structure as part of the new center. The metal box was still there. The old photograph was framed on the wall. Isaiah stood alone for several minutes. Then he placed his hand against the frame. You were right, Dad. He smiled. They almost took it. He paused. But they didn't. Outside he could hear the sound of tools. A welding machine. Someone laughing. A hammer striking wood. A teacher explaining how to read a blueprint. Life. The exact kind of life Samuel had imagined decades earlier. Isaiah walked outside. A young student approached him. Mr. Cole? Yes. My instructor says you built this place. Isaiah shook his head. My father started it. The student looked confused. But he never finished. Isaiah smiled. No. He looked back toward the building. He just waited for someone to. The student nodded. Then ran back inside. Isaiah remained on the sidewalk. The neighborhood looked different now. But the house on 214 Mercer Street was still standing. The magnolia tree had grown taller. The brass number was still beside the door. 4 simple digits. A reminder that a home is more than brick. A piece of land is more than a line on a map. And a name written on an old document can sometimes carry more weight than an entire city government realizes. Isaiah had spent decades believing his father had lost the land because he wasn't powerful enough to protect it. He finally understood the truth. His father had protected it. He had simply needed someone to find what he left behind. And when that moment came, Isaiah didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to become someone else. He only needed to open an old box, read the papers, and refuse to let someone else's version of history replace his family's truth. That was the victory. Not the money. Not the lawsuit. Not the headlines. The victory was that a black man's name, once pushed out of a city record, was now carved above a door where hundreds of young people walked through every week. Samuel Cole had wanted to build something that would outlive him. He finally did. And Isaiah made sure the city remembered who built it. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives quietly. On an old sheet of paper. In a forgotten signature. In a box nobody thought was worth opening. And sometimes, after decades of being told that something was never yours, you discover the truth. It was yours all along.